Nice and quiet today. Let me shut my phone up. Okay. All right. So, welcome everybody. We'll keep this nice and simple and casual. Don't have a lot of math to trudge through. This is mostly concept today, and maybe, of course, we're going to look at some equations. It is kinetics after all. But I want to focus on an application in particular of catalysis today, which are enzymes. I introduced this last Thursday. We talked about enzymes being biological substrates, biological material. The proteins, they're typically made out of amino acids, which there are 20 natural ones. And enzymes are specific proteins that serve one function, which is to facilitate some chemical reaction that your body wants to do. We'll look at some examples today. And all it does is catalyze that reaction. Okay? So there are a long series of types of reactions that our body wants to do. Most of them are exceedingly difficult to do at room temperature water in aqueous solution. And so the body, just through evolution, needs to find ways to optimize those processes, to do this chemistry as fast and as efficiently as possible. And that result of evolution is the development of enzymes. And every enzyme has a specific catalytic function. Now, some enzymes, as we could see, react with different molecules, different substrates. There's classes of enzymes, but there are some enzymes that only interact with one molecule. They're only there to just break apart a single molecule of interest. And we'll look at some examples of that. But again, this is a kinetics course, so let's think a little bit about the kinetics of this process and about how we can distinguish between enzymes based on their catalytic activity, right? How much faster do they make reactions, and how effective are they as catalysts? And what we're going to see, which is the amazing thing, is that that enzymes are extremely effective at catalysis. In fact, I'll show you some examples of some numbers that enzymes basically, they're limited by how fast molecules diffuse through water. And in some sense, they can't go any faster than they already are. And so they're just as optimized and as effective as they can possibly be. So the body enzymes are in some senses the best catalyst in the world. There are very few man-made catalysts that do the same job as an enzyme that do it better. Enzymes just naturally do it better. Which is really such an amazing feat of biology. Someone who doesn't really care about biology, I'm even impressed by this, because the ability for enzymes to catalyze things is really unparalleled. So let's look a little bit about how we do some analysis on enzymes and how we can quantify their ability to catalyze a reaction. So what we're going to learn is a model named after the two men. Did I spell that right? Yeah, Michaelis. The model named after two men who studied this for enzymes, called the Michaelis-Menten kinetic model. It's a very, very simple model. We've already kind of introduced the scheme last class, but let me remind you what the idea is that we start with a material, we start with a mixture of our enzyme and our substrate, the molecule we want to react. Substrate. The enzyme and the substrate are in equilibrium with a complex of the two. What happens is that the enzyme, just like the catalyst in the problem set, attaches to the molecule, form a complex, call that binding, right? Binding to the enzyme, the substrate binds to the enzyme. And then the enzyme can perform its duties and spit out the products. So what we create is a complex called ES. This is our substrate complex. And this is the reactive species. So this ES, right, you have them bound together. The enzyme's not going to do something to the S, and it's going to kick out a product. And recover the enzyme, right, for the next substrate to come in. Right? And of course, this is a catalytic cycle because where the catalyst, or sorry, the enzyme participates in the chemistry, but it doesn't participate in the stoichiometry. And theoretically, there should be a reaction out there that takes S directly to P without the enzyme. But what we'll see is that most of those reactions just don't, their kinetics are negligible. So you need the enzyme for them to happen. So the catalyst does affect the system chemically. It is participating in the chemistry. But the point is that you get the enzyme out and you put it in. So there's no net change to the enzyme. So the enzyme doesn't participate in the stoichiometry. Okay. So we need to assign some rates to these different things. Right? So we can assign an association rate. Right? So there's some rate that association between the substrate. And then there's also a rate of the catalysis, right? The reaction itself. So we'll call this Kcat for catalysis. Okay, so there's a couple of assumptions that we can make here. One thing is that this may not be 50-50. And in some sense, maybe this prefers to bind and not the other way. Right? Or maybe it's just 50-50 that it doesn't have any preference and delta G is 0. So there's some options here. It could be that K1 is larger than K minus 1, or they could be equal to each other. So we'll think about those two assumptions. Right, so let's first assume that association, that complex formation, is at chemical equilibrium. Always. And so what we can say is that K1 is equal to K minus. And now let's think a little bit about this reaction. The step, if we have ds, des, dt, the formation rate of the complex, it's going to be.
Wait, sorry, K1 equals K minus 1, or would it be K1 equals negative K minus
1? They should be, the rate constants are positive.
Oh, okay.
Because they're how many times does the molecule react per second? That's a positive number.
Okay, gotcha.
The rate of change of a concentration, though, may be negative.
So could you say that like
des dt may
-1
be positive or negative? Well, this term right here may be positive or negative. You may be losing or gaining your complex.
Okay, I see.
So we might put a negative sign here if you want to think about the loss.
Okay, I see.
But K1 is always a positive number.
I got you. All right.
All right, so ES forms from K1 with E and S. Minus, and we lose some through K minus 1 ES. And DS, formation of the products, is equal to minus D.
Wait, formation of the product or formation of the substrate?
So, sorry, going backwards.
Okay.
It's the opposite of the formation rate of. Oh, sorry, that's not true. Let me start over again. Where this is equal to minus K1 ES plus K minus 1 ES. Right, and that is the negative of it, right? So minus ES T. So the formation rate of the destruction rate is equal to the opposite of the formation rate, right? Which is exactly what you were thinking. Right, and so what we have because K1 and K minus 1, what we can now think about is the ratio of the change in ES divided by the ratio of the change of the reactants. So how much do they change relative to each other? And we can do a little bit of math. And what we find is that these rates are equal to K1 over K minus 1, which is equal to 1. Right, and that makes sense, right? Because the products form just as much as the reactants do in this process, and so the ratio of the rates is equal to 1. And so what I can write now is I can define an equilibrium constant for this. Which I'm going to call big K sub S, which is the concentration of the product over the concentration of the reactants. Which turns out to be, once you do the algebra, equal to the ratio of these two rates. So the equilibrium constant of this process depends on whether one goes faster than the other. Right? And this turns out to be a general proper result. That the equilibrium constant in a reaction is a ratio of the forward rate divided by the reverse rate. So this is equal to 1 in this case. But we'll just leave it like so. So we have this Ks. So I could also write, instead of K1 and K minus 1, I could just write Ks. Ks tells me something about it.
Ks equals 1.
Yes, in this case it equals 1, right? But it may not equal 1, right? It may be something else. They may actually prefer to bind ES over breaking it apart.
Okay, but with the assumption.
But right now, for this assumption right now, we're thinking they're equal.
Okay.
Okay, but it could be any. And it could be any number. It's a rule. Okay, so let's see if we can solve some kinetics. You can think a little bit about the kinetics of, right? We ultimately want to think about the formation of our products, right? Let's break this down a little bit. First, what we're going to think about now is the rate of formation of our products, which is equal to Kcat times the concentration of our reactive complex. Here's first order. Right, and I'm going to define this rate of formation. Right, this has units of moles per liter per second. Right, it kind of looks like a velocity. Right, it's some material that's being created at some rate. Right, it has a velocity, so we're going to call this V for velocity. And so what we could say is that the velocity of the reaction is equal to Kcat times the concentration of ES. So this is what we call the velocity of the reaction, which is how fast the product get created per second. Right?
Wait, is this a V or a
Yes.
U?
So V.
Okay.
Just a funky looking V. Maybe you think of it as product formation speed, right? As the units of per second. Okay. Well, we have that Ks, our equilibrium constant, is equal to ES over E times S. And as this reaction proceeds, how do the concentrations change of everything as the system processes? Well, the current concentration of E at any point, the enzyme, is the original concentration of the enzyme, not, minus the amount of complex there is, right? So if you have a mole of enzyme in your mixture, and half of them are bound to S, then you're left with half a mole. So we have some initial concentration, right? And then we can solve this now for the concentration of ES, right? The thing that we can't really measure, right? We can measure the concentrations of the protein, the enzyme. We can measure concentrations of the substrate, right? You do that every time you take a pill. We put 10 milligrams of escitalopram in the body. And you know roughly how many enzyme proteins you have in your body. But you can't really measure at any given point how many enzymes have substrates connected to them. So that's a number that we're going to have to fudge over using the steady state approximation because ES forms very rapidly, right? The rate of creating ES just as fast as the rate of destroying it, so its rate of formation is 0. So ES, we can solve for it, says that it's equal to E naught times the concentration of your substrate divided by this equilibrium constant plus S. This is by the steady state approximation. And now we have a steady state concentration for our substrate, our complex, and we can plug this into our velocity. So the velocity of our reaction, let me get all of it right, is K cat. The rate at which the enzyme works times E naught, the initial concentration of the times the concentration of the substrate divided by Ks plus the concentration of S. Right. I can rewrite this a little bit. This is equal to K cat times the initial concentration of the enzyme divided by 1 plus the equilibrium constant of binding divided by the initial concentration of S naught. So the rate at which this forms, let's look a little bit on what this says. So what this says is that our product formation rate, of course, depends on how fast the enzyme can process our material. That makes sense. It also is proportional to the amount of enzyme we have in the system. Right? With twice as many enzymes, you can react twice as many molecules. And then we have a denominator here. We have a 1. And then we have this ratio of Ks over the initial concentration of S naught. So let's think a little bit about the kind of limits. How does the rate of formation of our product change depending on how these change? Right, so let's think a little bit about it. Well, what we see from this system is that if our substrate is high concentration, right, it's an excess, right, what happens? The rate slows down. Right? Why does it slow down? Well, because here we have a denominator. S0 is large. Sorry, no, that's the opposite. So if S0 is large, then this number is small. Okay, yeah, so I have it flipped. Sorry, these speeds up. Right? And the reason why is that you've got a bunch of enzymes floating around. And ideally, what you want is every enzyme in your system to be performing the task simultaneously, right? You're using 100% of your work. And so as S increases, this number gets smaller. And so this denominator gets smaller. And therefore, the rate increases. Okay, so what this is saying is that as you increase the amount of S, the rate also increases. Okay? But notice that it's tempered in the sense that, right, the rate increases linearly with E naught. That makes sense. You have twice as many enzymes that react. You do twice as fast in your production. This is dependent on the value of Ks. Right? What is Ks? Well, Ks is how willing it is to make use of this. Right? So let's think about the situation when Ks is large. All right? When Ks is large, most of your enzyme is bound. Okay? So what that means is that when Ks is large and most of your enzyme is bound, it's very hard to kick the substrate out. So you bind the substrate to your enzyme, and if Ks is large, you bind it, it gets stuck. It associates very, very rapidly with the enzyme. And now the problem is that the enzyme can't get rid of it. Right? So if you think about the substrates as being customers, and the enzymes are cash registers, and all the enzyme does is check you out. You obviously, if you have 10 customers, the fastest way to process 10 customers is to have 10 registers, right? So we double the number of registers, the rate of checking out increases by 2. Right, but what if Ks is large? That means that the affinity for the customers to just hang out and shoot the shit with the cashier and not leave is high. This is where the customer is being involved with the client or with the cashier. And what it says is that by and large, at equilibrium, most of the customers at equilibrium are sitting at the cashiers. So that means that if Ks is large, the cashiers are always filled up. They're never getting rid of people. The residence time of the substrate is too long. The enzyme isn't kicking things out. So as Ks gets bigger, the rate of production goes down because the enzyme can't efficiently remove stuff. Okay, but if you have, all right, so let's look at that, right? So let me write that down. So if Ks is large, hard to remove substrate. It sticks. It's a sticky substrate. But notice that if Ks is large, the denominator gets modified based on the concentration of S naught. Now, why is that? Right, so you've got sticky enzymes. But what this is saying, if you've got a sticky enzyme but a large concentration of your substrate, it speeds up again, right? Because you have a large number here, and then you start to build a large number here in the denominator. This term eventually gets smaller, so this increases. Now, why is that? Well, the idea is Le Chatillier's principle. If you have a high concentration, right, you have an equilibrium that lies towards the complex, and you start to pump your material, your mixture with more product, with more reactants, more S. What does Le Chatillier's principle want to do? It wants to reestablish the equilibrium by creating more complex. You increase the denominator of your equilibrium constant, S, and therefore your numerator increases because they have to maintain the ratio. So as S goes up and Ks goes up, the rate also increases as well. So large S negates this by Le Chatillier's principle. All right, so we've got a balance of things, right? I love thinking about, again, we can think a little bit about, for instance, if you have very little enzyme, if your rate is really slow, if you have very little enzyme, the enzymes are really efficient at calculating things. So the KCAT is large. They spit them out really fast, but you have a very small number of enzymes. Your rate is very slow because E naught is really small. So there's a balance between the binding, how effective the binding is, and how much enzyme you have and how fast the enzyme does its job. And the thing is that you want a balance between stickiness. You don't want your substrate to be too sticky because then it never leaves. But you also want it so that it can efficiently kick molecules out, but you don't want it to be, you don't want Ks to be really, really small where the system doesn't bind at all, because then it's not an effective enzyme. It's not an effective substrate. You think about S as being your drug, and your drug involves an enzyme. Well, go ahead.
I thought E was the drug.
No, E is the enzyme.
Oh.
S is the substrate that we put into the enzyme.
Right, but I thought that like if you were gonna, like you would have an enzymatic drug, no?
Oh, so I'm thinking differently here. What I'm
Okay.
thinking of is you want
Like
to
an
inhibit
inhibitor? Okay, I
yes,
see.
exactly. You want to inhibit it. What we're going to look at, one of the examples I'm going to look at is once we get to it, is the enzyme that breaks amino acids down in your gastric juice. And if you have an excessive amount of that enzyme, you break down your amino acids too aggressively. I forget what that's called. It's a certain disease. And if you don't have enough of it, you can't break the enzymes down, and your GI tract can't dissolve,
Right.
do anything, and it fucks your pH up, and you get gastric reflux. So we usually use inhibitors for these things, right? To maintain the pH and things like that, to maintain. So if you have an enzyme that's overactive or underactive, we can use a substrate, a drug, to modulate the ability of the function. Talk about that. Okay, so let's look a little bit. So what we're going to see when you work out this math, and we draw a little graph. This is what a biochemist would do in the lab. They're going to say, hey, I'm going to look at my enzyme, and I'm going to look at the velocity of my reaction as a function of the substrate concentration. This is exactly what you would do for an inhibitor, right? You want to inhibit an enzyme. You're going to feed in something that binds to it. And what you want to do, right? If you're developing a drug, you want to figure out how much drug you need to put in order to get maximum activity. But the fact of the matter is that because of this 1 over Ks here, as the concentrations increase, the velocity is going to start slowing. So what we see initially, so we see a curve that grows linearly as a function of E naught, right? So at small concentrations, the velocity is going to be proportional to small concentrations. You're going to have K cat times E naught, that's just a number, times 1 plus something over the concentration of the substrate. So if we break this down, we're going to get a substrate here in the numerator. So this should be linear initially. So what's going to happen is the rate's going to increase. And then the Ks over S naught starts to kick in and get large. Well, what's going to happen is it's going to start to roll off like this, right? And the idea is there's some limit. Right? There's some limit to how fast this reaction can go at some given epsilon, some given concentration of enzyme. And the reason why the rate tapers off is because you run out of enzymes, right? The idea is down here, you have more enzymes than you have substrates, right? So you have lots of registers open, the substrates can come in, do their job. And the more substrates you bring in, the faster you can process them because you have lots of open, right? It's like Walmart on Black Friday, they got all the registers open for once. And they can process lots of people. But eventually, right, as your substrate concentration gets higher, your enzymes start to run out of spots. You have to start waiting in line. And so the rate starts to taper off at the limit where you have more substrate than enzyme. The enzyme can't process it fast enough. And the enzyme will just keep up with as much as it can, but eventually it's going to taper off. So we can call this line here V max, right? The maximum velocity. And that's going to be equal to K cat times the maximum amount of enzyme that you have, which is E naught. That's the fastest the reaction can go, right? Which is where you have exactly 1 molecule of substrate per molecule of enzyme. And the enzyme can process at its rate, and that's the fastest it's going to go. So we have this Vmax term. And biochemists use a special point on this curve. Right? Remember when we do titrations, for instance, we don't really think about what pH this roll-off happens on a pH curve. You think about the equivalence point. Right? Remember when we titrate, we look for the equivalence point, which is the midpoint between the bottom, the pH of the conjugate base and the pH of the conjugate acid. Right? You find that equivalence point between. And so biochemists or kineticists have that equivalence point. We say, what is the concentration of the substrate that gets us halfway to Vmax? So I choose Vmax over 2 and say, hey, I'm halfway there. And that corresponds to a specific concentration. And that concentration of S we refer to with this equilibrium constant K sub n. So this is the halfway equilibrium. This is equal to ES over S plus E at the halfway point. We can calculate exactly what S you need for that. We'll calculate Km. This Km is let me see what we call it exactly. Always forget what the term for this is. Right? This is in some sense the binding efficacy of the substrate. Right? This tells you roughly how much substrate you need to put in to get half your activity. Okay, so when people were looking at drugs, for instance, they have a drug that inhibits an enzyme. If you have an inhibitor, right, what would that do? Well, that would slow the rate of the enzyme down as a function of the kinetic, or sorry, a function of the inhibitor concentration. Well, an inhibitor slows the reaction down. And so you'll find the halfway point to where the kinetics of that enzyme are halfway between the maximum and 0, right? Where you've turned off the enzyme by 50%. It's the opposite of this case. Right? And you find some concentration of your substrate that evokes a 50% turn on. And we call that Km. And this is what's called the binding efficacy. This gives you a sense of how much drug you need to put into your body in order to evoke a 50% response from your system. So what typically a pharmacologist will report is they're always interested in this Km point, right? Because Km has units of molar. Typically, they're in units of nanomolar, right? And this is the rough concentration of drug required to stimulate a response. So you want your drug to have a really, really small Km, right? Because you want to put as little drug as possible into the body to evoke as much change as possible. You don't want to take a horse pill for everything. Right? And in fact, if you take pharmacology with Dr. Chirillo, he'll teach you that one of the other things you have to balance is that you want your drug to be as effective as possible, right? That it binds very, very fast to the substrate. You don't want to pump your body full of the substrate because you don't know what's going to happen down the line. Right? This is one of the problems with, for instance, with Tylenol. Now, it doesn't cause autism, so I'm not going to say that. But one of the things that Tylenol does is there's a certain enzyme, right? Tylenol affects a certain enzyme in your body that helps do pain relief. And the way that the Tylenol is metabolized in your body after it's being used, and it secretes it is by processing it through the liver. And there's a couple of different enzymes in the liver that break down Tylenol. That break it down into smaller parts and then you pee it out. And one of the problems with Tylenol is that when you take a lot of Tylenol, your body again binds to it in the pain receptors to turn them off. And then that Tylenol, the substrate concentration left over, gets fed into the enzymes in your liver, and your liver learns to start expecting large amounts of Tylenol being passed through it. So what your liver does is it starts to overexpress the enzymes that are used to break the Tylenol down. And so whenever you, and so what happens in an alcohol, not an alcoholic, and someone who uses heavy Tylenol, for instance, alcohol makes this worse. Your body overexpresses the enzymes used to break down that Tylenol. And then basically what happens is that everything that gets passed through your body now also gets affected by those overexpressed enzymes. And so what happens is that you increase the amount of Tylenol, you increase the amount of enzymes in response. The enzymes start breaking stuff down more than it should in your liver. And eventually you start to get a buildup of things in your liver from that overactive breakdown process. And in fact, alcohol in particular, the process of how we process alcohol in our metabolism is that process is connected to the way that we process Tylenol in our liver as well. And when you use Tylenol to bump up, to make your liver kick into full gear, basically overactive, it doesn't process the alcohol excessive correctly. And you get an over buildup of acetaldehyde in your bloodstream, and eventually your liver fails. So there's a balance here. Right? So for an effective drug that has low side effects, we want a drug that has as low of a Km as possible for its target, so we don't have to worry about processes down the line that have a larger Km for that material that are much more toxic to your body. So that's a super important number, and we can learn it from kinetics. And another thing that's really useful, and this is kind of similar to a scheme that you're going to do in the lab next semester with a reaction, is what we can do is we can measure the initial kinetics of this. Right? We can just put a little substrate in here and see what happens immediately. Low amounts. What we can do is we can approximate the function near the beginning right here with a line. It's roughly linear. So we can approximate the function with this line here. So this is kind of like the kinetics at low substrate concentrations. And what you can show is that the velocity is Vmax of S times the concentration of S over Km. So what you can do, if you know your enzyme, you know how fast it reacts, and you can measure how much substrate you have and how fast the system reacts at a small amount of substrate, you can determine Km directly. So this is how we determine Km. We make a measurement at small substrate concentration. And we measure our velocity of our reaction. And if we know E naught, how many enzymes we have in the system, we can calculate Km directly. Every single drug that goes through clinical trials goes through this process. This is what's called pharmacokinetics, kinetics of pharmacology, and that's all about, for instance, Km and other types of metrics. Take pharmacology with Dr. Trillo. You'll get sick and tired listening to this. Okay. So let's learn a few things about this process. Right? Let's see what we can learn. Right? Let's make it a little more complex. So let's go to the case that I think is maybe more interesting to everybody, which is inhibitors. So let's look at inhibitors now. Right? So enzyme inhibitors. Right, so we're going to look at two different types of inhibitors. There's two different kinds. There's actually a lot of different kinds, but let's first look at what's called a competitive inhibitor. The reaction that we're going to do is very similar to before. We start with E plus S, or we're just going to start with E. We have our enzyme. Along one path, we have kinetics for adding S. We can add S here, and we have a equilibrium constant Km for that process to form ES. And then this reacts at Kcat to form our product plus our enzyme. Right? But an inhibitor is another molecule that we bring in. Okay, so the idea here is that you have some process that's breaking something down. So the substrate, right? Maybe you have something that cleaves a molecule in half, and your body is overexpressing that, and you're cleaving things too much, right? So you're going to design an inhibitor to slow that cleaving process down. And the idea is that KCAT is just too fast. Your body's got too many of these enzymes, and it's destroying, it's eating something in your body. And so you want to slow that down. So what we're going to apply is what's called an inhibitor, which is a drug that will bind to the enzyme and compete with the binding of the substrate. Right? We want to give the enzyme something else to do so it doesn't deal with the substrate element. So what we can add now, can instead draw another series, right? We can go another direction. Right, by adding an enzyme, we call I, or sorry, inhibitor, we call I, and we'll say that this has a rate of association Ki. Right? And that's going to form some inhibited complex, EI, that we're going to assume does nothing, right? No reaction, right? It turns off the enzyme. Okay. Right, so basically we're just going to block the enzyme from doing its job. All right, we're going to do the same analysis as before. We're going to treat right. What can we do here? Well, one thing that we can do is treat now the enzyme at steady state. Because if the enzyme is not going to associate with S, it's going to associate with I. And either it's going to break down or break this way. And so there's a balance, right? Anything that forms here, any rate of formation of EI is going to be equal to an opposite rate of formation of ES and vice versa. So they're equal and opposite to each other, the two rates. And so what we can say here is that
Km equals Ki. Is that it?
no, we can't say that. No, hold on a second. Yeah, good point.
Wait, what does the M stand for?
Let me start. M.
Yeah.
Oh, so this is Km. So let me give you the exact term for this. So this is what's called the Michaelis constant, right? And it's the concentration at which a substrate causes 50% of the enzyme's activation. It's turned on 50%. It's how much. It's basically how much substrate do you need to put in for your enzymes to be on half on.
Okay.
So actually, so what Km is here is going to be equal to the concentration of the complex divided by the concentration of the concentration of S. Or sorry, S. So the smaller this is, the less substrate we have to put in to turn it on.
Okay.
Okay. So basically what we can say is that as Km goes to 0, our enzyme binds S with delta G of binding, the Gibbs free energy to bind, goes to minus infinity. Right? So as Km gets smaller, it becomes more and more spontaneous to bind the substrate to the enzyme. So an effective drug has a small Km. Good drugs equal small Km. You want to put in as little drug as possible to evoke a response. So from this, we could say, well, one thing that we can look at is the initial concentration of the enzyme. Well, that's going to be equal to the current concentration of the enzyme plus the concentration of the complex plus the inhibited complex, right? Some of the enzymes are going to be doing something, some of them are going to be inhibited, and some of them are free. And so we can apply this now to our Michaelis-Menten equation. Which says that the velocity of the reaction is equal to E naught. Let me clean this up. Remember, the more enzyme you have, the faster a reaction is going to occur. Times the concentration of the substrate times K cat over S plus Km. 1 plus the concentration of your inhibitor divided by Ki. So let's look at what's happened now. We go back to the equation that we had on the previous board, which was no inhibitor. Let's go back and look at that velocity. Here it's proportional to K cat times the enzyme concentration divided by 1 times something dependent on Ks. Ks has something to do with the binding efficacy, similar to CHEM. So what do we have in this case? Well, now we have E0 K cat. We have some S's here that we can divide by if we want. I can actually do that right now. We'll just clean that up. So we can delete this. This becomes a 1. And then we have a Km for S here. That looks more similar to what we had before, exactly like we had before. This is the same thing that we had. We had E naught times K cat divided by 1 plus the binding constant, right, which is how strongly the complex forms, divided by the concentration of the substrate. That's what we had before. But now the denominator, this substrate part, is now modified by an additional term. I'll clean this up a bit so it looks cleaner. Right? We have the same term now, but now it's multiplied by the inhibitors part of that term. So now what happens is that the velocity, which is the rate of formation of the products, again, looks like we had before, but now when we turn the inhibitor on, the rate changes. So if Ki is 0, for instance, there's no inhibition, then this disappears. And we get back to the original equation. But if Ki is non-zero, right? If Ki is non-zero, right, this term now becomes positive, greater than 1. This becomes larger. So this denominator now grows, and the rate slows. Right, so what we can see is that at small concentrations of their inhibitor, the rate is proportional to 1 over the rate constant of the inhibitor. Oh, I have this flipped. I'm sorry. Sorry, guys. I have the I and the Ki flipped. And we get the same result.
Wait, so the Ki is on the bottom, even though Km.
Yeah, I screwed this up. Sorry, guys. Yeah, right. So let's look again. So if I is large and Ki is non-zero, meaning that it inhibits, right? V decreases, right? It looks like V roughly goes as 1 over the concentration of the inhibitor. Right? And so you can kind of think of this as just being an additional number that the Km gets multiplied by. And so this number gets big, and so the equivalent effective binding constant, Km, this gets small. And that means this gets large, right? So what happens is that as Ki as the inhibition rate grows, Km over S, Km, the Km term grows small. Right? So you can kind of think that the binding efficacy of the drug now gets worse, which kind of means that the effective Km grows, which means that the drug is less effective. Okay. So what the inhibitor does, the inhibitor binds, replaces the substrate in its position, it outcompetes the substrate and says, hey, you can't go in there. The enzyme would rather hang out with me. And so if the enzyme is really effective at binding, then Ki is going to be small. Ki is going to be small. Do I have Ki here? No, Ki, sorry, let's write Ki. That's the inhibitor equilibrium constant. That's going to be equal to E I over EI. Right. And so if the enzyme likes to bind to the inhibitor, Ki is going to be small. Ki is small. This number is large. That means this denominator is large, and therefore the rate is slow. Okay, so what happens is that as I grows or as Ki gets smaller, which means you have more inhibitor or the thing likes the inhibitor more than it did before, it binds it more readily, your rate gets slowed down. And the inhibitor makes the catalytic process less effective because it crowds out the substrate. Right, and what it says is that now the substrate, right, the enzyme now prefers energetically to be bound to the inhibitor, and so the substrate doesn't have any room. It gets locked out, and the enzyme gets deactivated too, right? So the big thing here is that the only way for this to recover is for it to go backwards. The enzyme cannot process the inhibitor to form a new product. It can't do an enzymatic process on the inhibitor like it's another substrate. So this gets blocked off. Up here, there are two ways to regenerate the enzyme, right? You can go backwards through equilibrium, or you can react to form the product, and you get the enzyme back. But the inhibitor blocks off that forward route. So now the only way for the enzyme to ever move forward is to go backwards. And if Ki is really, really large, meaning the inhibitor loves to bind to that enzyme, it's never going to happen. So basically, as the inhibitor gets more effective, the reaction goes this way instead. Kinetics shift to the inhibition, turning the enzyme off. All right, let's look at another example. There's another type of inhibition, so that was competitive, right? That was the inhibitor crowding out the substrate to turn off the enzyme. But we can also have what's called non-competitive inhibition. We'll also say mixed inhibition. And that works a little differently. Here, what we can say is that S can be added with equilibrium constant Km, or an ES. And this goes K cat to E plus P. We can also add an inhibitor at binding constant K sub I to form I. But imagine that this inhibitor goes somewhere else on the enzyme. The enzyme has a couple places for molecules to bind, and the enzyme goes somewhere else in a different pocket. And so what this can do now is it can also bind to S. Yes, and now we form a complex that has the inhibitor and the substrate in it. We also have an equilibrium getting rid of the I, or that Ki prime. And this can also react at some other kinetics to form some other product. Maybe it's the same product. I don't know. Doesn't matter. Okay, so the idea here is that our enzyme is a Pac-Man that's got two spots. So it kind of looks like this. So case one is we have, let me draw this right. So you have a Pac-Man that's got two crevices in it. Something like that. And the enzyme, or sorry, the substrate goes into here. We now have something that looks like this. It's got the enzyme, right? This is ES. And then we're left with our enzyme again, plus our product. I like this. Product. But we can also bring in, and of course this happens at some kcat. This binds at some km. But what we can also do is bring in an inhibitor, right? Which goes into a different spot. Goes there instead. And so I can have an inhibition complex. This, that again has some association Ki. Right? And then S can choose to come in if it wants. S has some ability to come in here. And now what I have is a complex that's bound to two things. I have my substrate here, and I have my inhibitor. This is ESI. And we can say that eventually what this does is it goes on to react at some other time. Right? I don't know. It might kick the inhibitor out. It might still be there. I don't know. Okay, and it makes another thought. We can say, for instance, it makes it through some other process. It does the same thing, but it does it at a different rate. Okay, so K-cat and K prime are kind of the same thing, but they specify the rates at when you're inhibited versus when you're not inhibited. Right? Process is the same. Right? There's lots of proteins like this. And most inhibitors, I think, generally fall into this category. There are exceptions. Of course, there are some things you just want to turn off. But sometimes you want to modulate the rate. Like maybe you don't want it to go as fast as you still want it to run. You don't want to shut it down. Do things like this. And what you find is that if we'll just look at one example. If K prime is equal to 0, meaning the inhibitor turns off the protein, shut the protein off, shuts enzyme off. You can show that the velocity of this reaction equal to, if I write this, the concentration of the enzyme times, I need my quotient here, the concentration of the substrate, just like before. But K-cat gets modified by 1 plus I over Ki. And then we have just below the same thing that we have for Michaelis Menten. So in this situation, the important thing is that now instead of the binding getting affected, where Km is getting modulated by the inhibition denominator, now K-cat is getting modulated. So what this does now is it says that the effective rate of catalysis is modulated by the inhibitor. It doesn't change how how the enzyme binds to the substrate. Km is left unchanged. But the chemical efficacy, the chemistry, sorry, the catalysis, I should say, is changed. Right? So this is called, so what happens is, what we can say is that Km is unaffected. But Kcat is scavenged by the inhibitor. Right? The inhibitor just slows it down. It's like it's a drag on the thing. So we call this non-competitive. Right? And it's non-competitive because it's not fighting the substrate for position. Right? They're not jockeying for the enzyme. They can both hang out on the enzyme. It's just that the inhibitor changes the structure of the enzyme significantly to affect its efficacy as a catalyst. So it's not blocking anything. It's not competing for space. They can both hang out there. But the fact of the matter is that, you know, think going back to registers. This is your cashier. This is your customer, the substrate. And in a non-competitive situation, the inhibitor comes in and that's your manager breathing down your neck. And naturally, people aren't as productive when they're being micromanaged. Right? And so what happens is that the rate at which the cashiers process the substrate slows down. You can still fit as many substrates as you can. That hasn't changed. It's just that the rate at which you process them slow down because you've got your manager breathing down your neck, making you anxious.
It's a good analogy.
Yeah, it is good. I'm very proud of myself for that one. Right. And then sometimes though, right, you can still, right, the assumption here is that the manager shuts you off completely so that you never go this way. But you could still make, right, maybe the inhibitor only slows you down a little bit, but you can still make products with the inhibited enzyme. This goes through K prime. And so if K prime is not 0, we call this mixed inhibition. Right? Which means that, again, what happens is that it slows, but not completely. Okay. Unfortunately, maybe I'll come back to this on Monday. There's ways to do Michaelis-Menten. You got substrates and you got inhibitors. And you only have to do some graphical kinetics, basically fitting some lines to determine whether your process can be inhibited. There's a really simple way to analyze all of this in a way that you can do in the lab and determine whether an inhibitor inhibits a process or not. And I don't quite have the time to do that. We'll come back to it on next Tuesday. Just chat about it briefly. Right? How do we put all this together into a way that we can start thinking about how to measure all of these processes in the lab? What I want to look at one more thing before we finish. Let's look at an example, right? How effective are these enzymes? So I want to show you a really cool example of an enzyme. Right. So my question is how effective the efficacy of enzymes. Right. Well, there's an upper limit to how fast an enzyme can work. Right. So what's the upper limit? So imagine you've got this box that's got some enzymes and substrates in it. You got a box. You can think of this as your bloodstream. I don't really care. And you've got an enzyme, right? So you've got this enzyme floating around. It's got a little binding pocket right there. I'll draw the binding pocket different color. There's a little binding for it. And floating around the system are substrates. So our substrates are little triangles. So we've got some substrates floating around, right? We have some concentration. This is E. These are S's. So what would the fastest possible rate that we get? Well, the fastest possible rate that we can have is that we have this random distribution of molecules in our mixture. Now, what's going to happen is that one of these is going to diffuse randomly into here. Right? So first we diffuse. Right? So we diffuse through diffusion enters the binding pocket. This is my little binding pocket. So there's some diffusion rate. Right? So this is a diffusion rate. Right? Which is in some sense, right, which is a function of, the velocity of the molecules in the liquid, in the solvent. Which of course, as you know, is dependent on temperature. And of course, it's also dependent on the viscosity of the solvent. So there's some rate, right? Eventually the thing has to kind of move in, right, at the diffusion rate. And then the fastest possible thing is that relative to the diffusion rate, it just, the enzyme is like that, right? Relative to the diffusion rate, the enzyme just snaps and releases. So what happens, so this has some K diffusion rate. And then K cat, what we're going to say is that K cat is much, much, much faster than K diffusion. So the idea is that it takes some time for things to meet. And that also that K1 is much faster than K. All right, so what that means is it binds instantly. And it reacts instantly. Right, that seems reasonable, right? So you're ultimately limited by how fast things are moving in your liquid. So I'm going to make a table. And so we'll define our table as we'll define it by the enzyme, the substrate, the value of K cat, which has units of inverse moles, the value of Km, which has units of molar, and we'll look at the ratio of K cat over Km. Right? Why would we look at that number? Well, this is the rate. This is basically the minimum rate of reaction as the substrate concentration goes to 0. Okay, so it's basically the slowest it can run. Right, that's what it is. It's the efficacy of the catalyst. So remember, the speed of the catalyst depends on how many molecules. And so the catalyst isn't producing a lot if there's not a lot of molecules to produce. So this tells us the minimum rate that it can run. Right, and diffusion, so it doesn't have an enzyme or a substrate. I'm just going to write diffusion here. And it has just one rate, so just a general rate. And that general rate, or K cat over Km for diffusion, is 10 to the 9. This is units of per second per mole per liter. So it's 10 to the 9. Okay. So whatever that speed is, it doesn't really matter. But that ratio of the catalysis of the enzyme at this fast rate divided by the binding constant, typically at diffusion unit, is 10 to the 9. If it binds everything and it reacts instantly, this is going to be about 10 to the 9. All right, so let's look at an example. So here's an example of an enzyme. This is called beta lactamase. And this is the protein within bacteria that confers antibiotic resistance. Right? So one of the enzymes that this works with is penicillin. So bacteria that express large amounts of this beta lactamase, which is a molecule that breaks beta lactam molecule. Penicillin is a beta lactam. Molecules that are bacteria that express this enzyme at large quantities are very effective at stopping antibiotics, right? And that's part of the convergent evolution of bacteria is as we feed more penicillin to them, they generate more lactamase, and then over evolutionary cycles, they evolve in such a way to generate more of this enzyme as a part of their defense structure. And so the rate at which this catalyzes is fairly slow. It's 2.0 times 10 to the 3. So it catalyzes about 2,000 penicillin molecules a second. It binds at 50% at about 20 millimolar concentrations. Right? This is not an amazing efficacy, but as you'll see, the minimum rate is 1.6 times 10 to the 8. Right? It's just an order of magnitude slower than the actual rate, the actual maximum rate. Right? It's 10x slower than max. That's pretty amazing. Right? So the idea is that you get this nice competition. You have something that processes fairly slowly, but it can bring in a lot of molecules pretty quickly. So the minimum rate you get is actually really effective. Right? And it's only about 10 times slower than the maximum possible rate it could have. That's really fast. So this is really, really a really effective way. In some sense, it's almost theoretically perfect way to break down penicillin. It's 10 times slower than it needs to, or it could be. Here's another one, and I'm going to show you this. I'm going to write this. Here's another one, chymotrypsin. This is a digestive enzyme that cleaves amino acids apart, that breaks peptide bonds. It has a kcat of 6.3. Times 10 to the 7. Look how fast that is, right? That cleaves them 1,000 times faster. And it turns out that its efficacy is that rate. So here's an interesting thing. Here's a protein, regardless of how much material you have in your system, at 50%, it has basically the same efficacy as it does at full speed. What this means is that this is an on-off switch. Basically, it's already at as fast as possible rate, and it can't go any faster. It's fixed. And so kcat over km is so let's say kcat over km. So 6.3 times 10 to the 7 divided by 6.3. So kcat over km. So let me just get this math right. 6.3 km. Times 10 to the 6. So this is an extremely effective peptide. This just works. What this means is that this peptide works effectively at 100% efficiency, regardless of substrate. Right? Regardless of how much there is to break down, the moment you bring in a molecule, it's already working at full power. And you need very few molecules to get it again. And so this is an extremely, extremely effective reaction. If you were to do the same reaction in acid without enzyme, and you ask what is Kcat over Km, the effective rate of this system without enzyme, it's on the order of 10 to the minus 12 per second. This enzyme speeds the reaction up by 18 orders of magnitude. It basically turns a reaction that's completely impossible into one that happens so fast that you can't make it go any faster. Right? So this is how we break down. This is how we break down protein in our body. We have chromatrypsin. I wish I had some more time to talk about it. Really beautiful structure. And what you find is that in chymotrypsin, which cleaves a peptide bond, it breaks a big chain of amino acids and cuts it down the middle at the peptide bond. And what happens is that within that protein, there are a certain number of amino acids that basically lock onto the substrate. All right, there's some hydrogen bonds that form, and there's three amino acids in chymotrypsin that connect to that peptide to react it, and there's cleave it. And it turns out that every protein that does that in any sort of mammalia body, anything that has a GI tract, that does these types of these cuts on peptide bonds, all have the same 3 amino acids in their binding pocket doing the catalytic work. So this is really interesting. You have divergent evolution in the body where you have different proteins doing different jobs for different substrates. But they also have convergent evolution in that each one of them facilitates a microscopic mechanism that involves 3 very specific amino acids that connect and do the work for them. And all of those proteins that cut different molecules all share that motif. They have the same 3 amino acids doing all the work in that protein. And so that's kind of the amazing thing is that there's this wide diversity of enzymes. Every enzyme reacts with a different molecule in a different way, but they all do it in roughly the same way. And so when you look at the nitty gritty, if you look at the inner details, and if I do this, remind me maybe next week I'll look at it. But the mechanism, the organic chemistry mechanism of this reaction, trypsin, is exactly the same process for every other trypsin and every other thing that cleaves amino acids. There's some in the liver, there's some in the GI tract, there's some in the urinary tract, some in your lymph nodes. There's all sorts. These things happen all the time. You got to cleave 2 peptides together. And every single one of those proteins, even though they serve different functions, they all cleave in the same way.